Well, hello there, and welcome to A Film a Day with me, Jordan Woodley. And today, very excited because, of course, being the end of the week, we get to do another MCU rewatch. And man, Captain America Civil War, I couldn't be more delighted to talk about this film. I mean, I'm getting to the point now in this series where, of course, every week I seem to be increasingly more excited being able to talk about the MCU films. And I think that was my feeling at the time. I think this is now the peak point in which almost every, if not every other MCU film was something I was incredibly excited to see. I mean, post-Avengers, as I've said, they were going through the experimental. Phase 2 was very much about experimenting with styles, with different directors, with sort of allowing the world to grow and expand in both terms of internally, in terms of their, the world of Marvel, but then also in terms of the world of cinema and what they actually had the ability to be able to do. And of course, we got to the end of Phase 2 with Ant-Man, and Phase 3 honestly feels like their wings finally unfurled, that it's about scale. Creatively, they've now sort of tested themselves and gone, okay, let's see what we can do for different styles and different sort of colours and flavours, and now it's them going, how big? Up to this point, we very much got a sense that the Avengers films were the big team-up, everyone together, or big, large-scale films, and each individual film, yes, they did have certain spectacle to them, particularly, of course, with like Winter Soldier, to some degree with Dark World, or at least that was the ambition, and of course with Guardians of the Galaxy. But this is the point in which every film is supposed to be treated like it has the scale of an Avengers film. We're at that point now where this is the cap third film, and you think, okay, we've seen the outside of the MCU, the war film that just simply has a super soldier in it, its own thing in the first cap. We have the Shield, the Black Widow, the introduction of Winter Soldier. That level of storytelling, and of course the way that it shifted the MCU and the status quo, and of course it had the scale of showing all the fighting and the abilities. And we are now at that third stage where it's a case of, why don't we make essentially an Avengers film? Why don't we kick off Phase 3 with an Avengers film? It's not an Avengers film, it's a Cap film, but it just simply has a display of all of the powers and abilities and storytelling, and it's no longer an isolated film, it is part of the grand story. Now, obviously, the first big issue with that is that this is probably the first film that is the first film outside of the Avengers films that is the episodic Marvel TV series that the MCU is accused of being. Up to this point, with the exception of their own internalized sequels, each film in the MCU felt like a film, and so you could watch Iron Man 2, and as long as you've seen Iron Man 1, you knew what was going on. If you watched Guardians of the Galaxy, yes, it's better to have a knowledge of Marvel, but frankly, Guardians of the Galaxy is a great space opera that just references things that we are aware of in the MCU. This is the point in which there is no version of this where you could have seen Civil War without having seen most of the preceding series of films. And I am fully aware that is an example of the biggest criticism of current, or at least of Phase 3 of the MCU. We don't know going forwards, because they are doing something wildly different with Phase 4, but Phase 3 was definitely, oh, I see now, I am now watching episodes of a continuing television story. And there will be films that are outside or try to be outside of that. Doctor Strange tries to do that, Black Panther, but frankly, even they feel like they benefit from an advanced knowledge, and there is a certain amount of arrogance to that. The idea that Marvel, the MCU had gotten to such a scale that it would just be assumed you have seen most, if not all, of the films. Therefore, it doesn't matter if we make a film like this. And so, from a cinematic point of view, yes, it's very hard not to be incredibly critical of that. However, switching hats and being an MCU fan and being a giant nerd that I am, this is the dreams come true film. This is we get to see not just everyone doing the superheroics, doing the the big scale fight, but it's them fighting each other and demonstrating their abilities in relation to each other. And on top of that, it is still the Russo brothers doing their conspiracy thriller style story, which I think works so well with everything that goes on. And yes, the other concern levelled at this is the fact that it's one that it's very hard to argue against, which is to say it's a Captain America film is a difficult thing because it has so many characters and perspectives, and of course, if you've seen the Avengers films, you could easily jump from character to character to character and go, well, this section here is clearly from the perspective of Tony Stark, or this section here is from the perspective of Wanda Maximoff. And in terms of saying, well, if the entirety of the film is not from Cap's point of view, or at least tangentially from Cap's point of view, then surely it is no longer a Cap film. It is just an ensemble film that he is part of. And yes, that is a difficult perspective to argue against. I still think thematically it does fit with the arc that I mentioned in Winter Soldier, in my discussion of Winter Soldier, that the great tragedy, and that is what Captain America's story is across the trilogy, is a tragedy of a man who simply has spent his life trying to find place in the world, and yet fails. He joins the army, becomes a super soldier, lives up to the potential that he always knew he had within himself, and just as he's reaching that realization of his potential, he's lost, he's frozen, he ends up in a time and place that is completely different to one that he knew. The second film, of course, establishes that he's joined S.H.I.E.L.D. and he's finding place within this organisation that he does recognise in the way how they work and how it functions. It's very much like the army, and yet, because they're spies and he is not a spy, and because of the way that it works in regards to superheroics and how the world works, again, he doesn't find his place there. This film is very much because if you were to watch the independent Avengers films, you think, well, you don't see that at all. He feels really like he suits the Avengers, he suits the world. Yes, he has certain quirks and elements of him that sort of make him stand out, but he doesn't seem out of place. This film establishes that there is still that sense of disconnect. And the thing he struggles with is, of course, this is the film where Peggy Carter dies, and she was his last link to his life. And all there is left is Bucky, but Bucky is, of course, brainwashed, reprogrammed, on the run, and so his hunt to try and save and almost redeem Bucky is not just the desire to save his friend. It is also the desire to save what he remembers of his life, to find some semblance of it. And the arc of the film, just like with Winter Soldier, demonstrates that though he seems like he has his place in the Avengers, it very quickly shows that he doesn't. He doesn't have a place there. This isn't where he will find that satisfaction, that sense of home that he is desperately looking for. And, of course, we see them fracture because of things that are out of his control. Some things that are out of his control and some things that are in his control. and we see by the end of the film that he has lost that as well. And again, he is stranded and, again, lost to the world, as it were, but in a very different way, and again, he has no home, he has no place, he is then on the run at this point. And so, yeah, it does show across the trilogy. If you forget the Avengers films, of course, the Russo brothers will go on to direct Infinity War and Endgame, and I think they inject more of that into those films. But if you just put a pin in those for a minute and just consider the trilogy of Captain America like you would consider the trilogy of Iron Man, with Iron Man, by the end of the third film, despite my feelings on the Shane Blackness of it, it was very clear that it concludes the arc of a man who feels the weight of responsibility for his own actions and the demons that he created, and that the end of Iron Man 3 is him finding solace in that. Now, of course, later films, including this one, undermine that, but in terms of that trilogy, that's finished in a satisfying way, where he obviously ends up with Pepper, and he's happy, and he's settling down, and he's no longer going to be Iron Man. With this, it's very much the opposite. It's Captain America does not have a place in this world. He is now ousted, and though he feels a sense of duty to people and to those he feels responsible for, he is so outside of everything that he has to just be underground, on the run, and in the hopes that one day he can redeem himself and find that sense of place. Very much in the I don't know why this pops into my head, but Quantum Leap with Sam is the great tragedy that perhaps he'll never find his return home. We'll get onto where that goes, of course, in the later Avengers films, but like I say, if you were to just watch this trilogy, there would be a great sense of tragedy in that story arc. But yeah, I do genuinely think this is a great film. I appreciate that there is a strange civil war, a division, both inside the movie and inside the fandom, that people really struggle with certain plot elements of it that they absolutely staunchly disagree with. They staunchly disagree with the positioning of Cap and Iron Man, the idea that Captain America, the soldier, is somehow against sanctions and controls over people, with any kind of power, and Iron Man, the great rebel, is for it. That people argue that their positions should be flipped. People have problems with Zemo, and I'll talk about that in a second. But Zemo, I know that that famously people have a real big problem with Zemo's role in the events of this film, and people have the issue with Bucky and the way that Tony reacts to the revelation of his parents' deaths. And that's a great dividing point in the fan base. Even the fan base, anyone who watches this film really, people really battle against each other about elements of this film. This is not a unifying film. People really like it, but there are certain plot beats and story arcs that people really struggle with because they don't agree with the way that it's laid out. Now, my besides those individual points, my one feeling is that yes, I do agree that there were issues in the plotting of this, regardless of what I feel about those individual things. And even though I like this film, because it has such a dividing effect on people, that's an issue. In the same way that I really like Last Jedi. Yes, I've said it, I really like Last Jedi. I'm aware that it really divides people. And despite my subjective opinions, objectively, if there is that much division, that a film hasn't worked on some level. Now my counter to that is the I suppose what you might call the Zack Snyder argument for Watchmen, where a lot of people have issues with Zack Snyder and the way he adapted the Watchmen film. And I've seen interviews and discussions that he had and the compromises that he had to make and the places where he had to put his foot down to try and make an authentic adaptation of the comic book. And because of compromises, there are elements of that film that people really take against. And there are Zack Snyder-y things that people also take against. But it was a film of compromise. Similarly, I think that this is such a large-scale film, and this is the first full Avengers-level film that's not an Avengers film. And I think, frankly, the fact that we got it to the quality that we did was fortune, and I wouldn't say luck, but I would say in the hands of lesser directors that this would have really flopped and struggled under the weight of its own pressure. And I think that's why they obviously later gave the Avengers films to the Russo brothers, because once they demonstrated that they could do this to some competency level, you would obviously give them the keys to the kingdom, because they demonstrate that it might not always work, but man, they managed to hold up mountains where other directors might have struck. Well, again, as I mentioned with Age of Ultron and Joss Whedon, it became just too much for him, and I think that's... and many other directors would have felt that same pressure. So I do want to talk about the Zemo aspect. The other plot beat aspects, they're debatable, there are opinions, but frankly, both sides have valid points, but the Zemo of it is my big sticking point, which is, I always defended Zemo. I always thought that he was a really interesting character within the context of the film. And yes, he's not Baron Zemo from the comics. He is something else. He is a completely different character who just has the name Zemo. Now, I know, obviously, if we step outside of, outside of this film into Falcon and Winter Soldier, they've course corrected and they've made Zemo more in line with the character from the comics. They've made him a baron with his own money and private jet, and he has the mask, and he's much more a comic book character. But putting that aside, that was not the original vision for the character. The original vision was an ex-military guy who just simply had the skills and ability to be able to manipulate global events to try and cause a collapse within the Avengers from the inside. And yes, I'm certain that the plotting of it is incredibly circuitous. That you look and you think, well, how did he manage to do that or arrange that? But I forgive it. I like the idea that we have a human character, and Zemo is famously a character who uses manipulation within the comics to that he isn't someone who has powers. He is a manipulator who uses his skills to coerce and corrupt. And I think that that's still demonstrated here. The fact that he's not a baron and doesn't have the resources, yes, that does put into question how he could manage to do some of the things he does in this film. But I still like the fact that he infiltrates, he manipulates, he exploits things that he might not have been in control of. But he sees them coming and he uses them to again undermine the relationships and the core dynamics within the Avengers, and then of course pulls the trigger to have them all fight amongst each other. And I do think that's a really cool demonstration of a character, and I do think he played so well. And people, of course, have gone on to say that they love him in Falcon and Winter Soldier. And yes, he probably is more realised and fleshed out, but that's a TV series, and that gives him the time. But the little we get of him, I really like within this film, personally, and I would definitely plant my flag in that respect, that I do think it's cool to have a character who does very little, but simply moves certain pieces in place to try and cause a domino effect of catastrophe. And yeah, and I mean, this, of course, is the great setup. It's the beginning of Phase 3, and this is the point where they're like, okay, we're not going to shyly drop Easter eggs or hints to what's going forward. We are going to throw everything into this film. Weirdly, not Doctor Strange, which is the next film in the series. Whatever. But everything going forward is going to come from this film. Of course, Spider-Man is the great moment that changed the audience. The people saw him in the trailer and and this was the people standing up cheering moment of the trailer, because Spider-Man, a character who no one thought would ever be able to be allowed into the MCU, just there he is, and he is so well placed. You have Black Panther, and I will save my discussion of Chadwick Boseman and Black Panther and how incredible and important that character is, because I can only talk so much in this video. But in this film, he is so good, and again, Chadwick Boseman just hits those beats so well, and the Black Panther, what a way to bring that character into the fold. And yeah, it was genuinely a great addition. To the point where, though obviously they set up the Tony Stark, Steve Rogers head-to-head of the Civil War, for most of the film, it's more a Steve Rogers, T'Challa head-to-head, in terms of T'Challa's the one who's going after Bucky, and it's just taking everything to stop him from murdering Bucky. And I think... I just think that's great. I think it's such a great arc in that film. And the scene between him and Zemo at the end is one of the great moments in the MCU. I mean, this has at least 3 great moments. There's there's the helicopter moment, and there's the line he said that Black Panther says in the when they've just all been captured and they're being taken in security vans, and he says, he gives a speech, and he says, as king and warrior, how long do you think you can stop me? And honestly, yes, nailed. It's so well done, and again, it opens up the Wakandan and the Black Panther and everything that in that respect that we're going forward with. And of course the continuation, the advancement of characters and arcs majorly happens here that we'll see paid off over the next 5 years, with both in the films going forward and in the TV series with WandaVision. Really, its roots are in this film more than any other. It's just such a good film. It's such a great way to kick off Phase 3. I genuinely think this film deserves its place, and for those who were quite critical of it, deserves reevaluation. And yes, there are things that don't work, but I still think as a whole, just that airport scene is that moment that I've wanted to see since childhood, and I think it's just wonderful to watch. Yeah, I love this film. I genuinely think it's great. I think I will at some point do the MCU ranking and throw it up on Twitter to sort of show where we are in terms of the positioning, but I do think this ranks quite highly amongst all of my the MCU films. But I will get to that at some point. I don't know when, but we'll see. No, great film. Absolutely deserves watching or rewatching, and it gets me excited for Phase 3, and we have got some really exciting stuff. This is no longer the point where there's a bit of uncertainty about the journey of the MCU. This is the point where each film will bring something new to the overall MCU that's exciting and worth looking forward to. Anyway, thank you for joining me. If you like this video, hit the like button, comment, and share the video, because it's always helped me in the algorithm. Subscribe to the channel and hit that little bell to get notifications of when new videos are uploaded. And do check out my back catalogue. Of course, the MCU rewatch playlist. This is coming along quite nicely. So, and follow me on Twitter at Jordan_Woodley, where I'm always tweeting about movies and TV shows, and share these videos once they're uploaded. Thank you for joining me. Take care.